Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history today. We are going to dive into the shocking history of King Edward IV, and a secret practice that not only shook his kingdom, but ultimately cost him his power and his dignity. The most powerful king of his time, a man who ruled over a vast realm, yet behind closed doors, he risked everything for his desires. How could such a scandal unfold in an age where honor was considered sacred? If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our most fascinating stories. It is the year 1461. The kingdom stands on the edge of collapse. But the greatest threat to King Edward IV does not come from the battlefield. It comes from within his own chambers. A king who vomited between courses just to keep eating. A man who prowled London streets in disguise, hunting married women while their husbands were away. A monarch who kept a rotation of mistresses he openly ranked by their qualities, and a death so mysterious that some historians now believe his own bedroom habits killed him. This is Edward IV, and his sexual practices were even more disturbing than you think. Edward IV didn't just have affairs, he ran an organized operation. Contemporary chroniclers described him as lecherous in the extreme. But what made Edward different from other womanizing kings wasn't just his appetite, it was his methodology. He had a system. First, there was his partner in crime, William Lord Hastings, his closest friend and fellow predator. These two would prowl through London together, seeking targets. They had a network of intermediaries, essentially scouts, who would identify attractive women and arrange secret meetings. One account describes how Edward would disguise himself and visit merchants' wives while their husbands were away on business. Another tells of women being summoned to private chambers in the Tower of London, the same tower where prisoners awaited execution. The Italian chronicler Domenico Mancini, who visited England and gathered first-hand accounts, wrote that Edward pursued with no discrimination the married and unmarried, the noble and lowly. But here's the disturbing detail, Mancini added. However, he took none by force. That sounds reassuring until you understand how medieval power worked. When a king, the most powerful man in the realm, expressed interest in a woman, saying no was nearly impossible. Edward didn't need physical force. He had something more effective: promises. Edward's seduction technique was calculated manipulation disguised as romance. He would promise marriage, titles, land for their families, protection, whatever it took to get what he wanted. And then, once satisfied, most of these promises evaporated like morning mist. One chronicler noted that Edward would whisper sweet nothings about making women queen, about elevating their families to power for women in medieval England who had almost no independent legal or economic standing. These weren't just romantic fantasies, they were lifelines, and Edward exploited this ruthlessly. The most famous example was Lady Eleanor Butler, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. She was devout, beautiful, and from a respected family. Edward promised to marry her under medieval canon law. A promise of marriage followed by sex actually constituted a legal marriage contract. Did Edward sleep with Eleanor Butler under this promise? A bishop later testified under oath that he had performed an engagement ceremony between them. If true, this meant that every child Edward later had with his actual queen, Elizabeth Woodville, was illegitimate. This single seduction, one broken promise to one woman, would eventually be used to declare Edward's sons bastards and justify their imprisonment in the Tower of London. They were never seen again. Edward famously boasted about ranking his mistresses like prized possessions. According to Thomas More, Edward bragged that he had 3 concubines who each excelled in different qualities: the merriest, the wiliest, and the holiest harlot in the realm. Let that sink in. The King of England openly categorized the women in his bed like horses in a stable. Each served a different purpose. Each was valued for a specific quality, and the term harlot, applied even to the holiest, shows how little respect any of them ultimately received. The holiest was Eleanor Butler, the devout noblewoman he seduced with marriage promises. The wiliest was likely Elizabeth Lucy, who bore Edward at least one illegitimate child, before disappearing from historical records entirely. But the merriest, that was Jane Shore, and what happened to Jane after Edward's death reveals the true cost of being a king's plaything. For 7 years, Jane Shore was Edward's favorite. She was witty, kind, and by all accounts, genuinely loved the king. Unlike his other conquests, she wasn't seduced with false promises. Her marriage was annulled, possibly with Edward's help, and she became his open companion. Then Edward died, and Jane's world collapsed. Richard de Edward's brother and the new power behind the throne, saw Jane as a symbol of everything corrupt about his brother's reign. He tried to charge her with witchcraft. When that failed, he charged her with harlotry, her punishment. Public humiliation designed to destroy her. On a Sunday in 1483, Jane was stripped to her skirt, essentially her underwear, and forced to walk barefoot through the streets of London, carrying a candle as a symbol of her disgrace. Crowds lined the streets. Richard expected them to mock her, to throw garbage, to humiliate the king's former __. It backfired completely. Thomas More recorded that Jane walked with such dignity, looked so beautiful despite her circumstances, that the crowds felt sympathy instead of scorn. Men lined the streets not to mock her, but to admire her. Richard's attempt to shame her only made him look cruel and petty. Jane survived. She outlived Edward, outlived Richard, and died around 1527, possibly in her 80s. If you've seen Game of Thrones, you've seen Jane's story. George R.R. Martin confirmed that Cersei Lannister's infamous Walk of Atonement was directly inspired by what happened to Jane Shaw 5 centuries earlier. Edward's sexual appetite was matched only by his appetite for food, and both may have killed him. Contemporary chroniclers didn't hold back. The Croyland Chronicle described him as a gross man addicted to conviviality, vanity, drunkenness, extravagance, and passion. Mancini wrote that in food and drink he was most immoderate. But here's the disturbing detail. Edward used emetics, substances that induce vomiting, so he could gorge himself at meals, throw up, and then return to eating again. This wasn't occasional excess. This was systematic medieval bulimia powered by royal privilege. The result, by his late 30s, Edward had transformed from a tall, athletic warrior into an overweight shadow of himself. Mancini described him as very fat, though not to the point of deformity. When Edward died suddenly in April 1483, at just 40 years old, no one could explain what killed him. The Royal Council gave no official explanation. Contemporaries speculated about poison, apoplexy, even melancholy, but modern historians have proposed a darker theory. Edward's countless sexual partners, drawn from every level of society, would have exposed him to diseases that medieval medicine couldn't identify, let alone treat. One scholar has recently argued that the symptoms described in cryptic contemporary accounts point to syphilis. The medieval chronicler Philippe de Comines wrote cryptically about Edward catching a chill while on a fishing trip. But in medieval French, to fish was a common pun on to sin, and Comines was hinting that Edward's final illness came from his final sexual adventure. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Edward lingered for about 10 days, long enough to name his brother Richard as protector, setting in motion the chain of events that would destroy his family. Edward Ive had everything. He was tall, handsome, charming, a brilliant military commander who won his throne at 18. He could have been remembered as one of England's greatest kings. Instead, his legacy is consumed by the consequences of his appetites. His broken promise to Eleanor Butler gave his enemies the legal weapon to destroy his sons. His systematic seduction of married women created enemies throughout the realm. His favorite mistress was publicly humiliated and nearly destroyed, and his own body, ravaged by excess in every form, gave out at 40. The Croyland Chronicle marveled that Edward could rule a kingdom while indulging in so many sensual enjoyments. But in the end, those enjoyments consumed everything he built. 500 years later, Edward Ive stands as proof of a truth that hasn't changed. There is no throne high enough, no power great enough to protect you from the consequences of your own desires. Somewhere in the distance, a candle flickers, stone walls hold the last warmth of the day, footsteps fade along a cold corridor, silk brushes against wood, a breath lingers in the dark. Time loosens its grip, the noise of the court dissolves, power feels distant. Only the human remains. You can almost hear the turning of a page. A book gently closing, history easing itself back into silence. Edward's world belongs to the past again. Its shadows stay where they are, its secrets rest, and the night becomes calm once more. If this quiet journey stayed with you, you are always welcome here. A soft like helps the story travel further. Sharing keeps the past gently alive, and subscribing allows these whispered histories to meet you again in the dark. Goodbye. And we will meet again.